These are the oldest stories, online at oldeststories.net. Shalmaneser's army marched out for conquest or tribute every single year of his 36-year reign, and for the first 27 of them, while the king was in good health, the king marched with them. We've looked at his grand westward campaigns, as well as his admiration for the Babylonians on the southern border, leaving us only with his generally less significant campaigns north and east. I say less significant only in comparison. The attacks against the growing state of Urartu in the north would set the tone for many more decades of attack on that kingdom, and is in fact the subject of the only epic poem known to be composed in his reign. Now, I warn you in advance that it's not a very good epic poem, at least not in translation, and the text is too damaged to really know how it sounded in the original Akkadian. But it is interesting that we have this at all. The context is his third year as king, and he's just set out against the Bit-Adini city of Til-Barsip, and he won a victory there. But as we mentioned previously, this particular year was unusual in that he finished his campaign in Syria quite early and had time for another in the same year. And this is the topic of the poem. Now, the style of the poem is really odd, even by ancient Mesopotamian poetry standards, and so I'm going to mostly be retelling it. And it goes something like this. The first few lines invoke the gods. Ashur, Ishtar, Shamash, Bel, and An have all come together to make Shalmaneser king of the universe. And that's just a standard praise opening. Then it mentions that the people of Bit-Adini and the general Hittite region have been defeated. Shalmaneser then turns to Ashur-bel-Ka'in, his turtan, which means that Ashur-bel-Ka'in is his chief advisor, his top government official, and general, and Shalmaneser commands the turtan to basically take a chunk of the army, hold down the newly captured areas, and make sure that the Hittites pay their tribute, and generally keep order. Shalmaneser, meanwhile, is going to take the rest of the army and apparently experience warfare with the Urartians and discover if theirs is a land with or without water. It's an odd turn of phrase until you think about the geographical context. Shalmaneser, of course, is very familiar with wastelands in which there is no water, and the amount of value in a land at this point in history is often closely correlated with the amount of potable water nearby. Thus, copying Ashurnasirpal's journey to the Nairi lands, Shalmaneser will now journey to the Urartian lands, which are, largely the same lands, just the kingdom has changed in the meantime. The king then gives a speech to all his officers, telling them to make sure all the weapons are sharp, their horses are armored, and that the soldiers are not misled or allowed to fear the Urartian slaves. They are, in fact, called slaves, even though they haven't yet been enslaved, but Shalmaneser's just anticipating what's coming next. Shalmaneser then announces in heroic verse that the god Ashur and the people of Assyria have both encouraged him to attack Urartu and praised his heroism. The speechifying thus taken care of, the army begins to march. The journey, as one might expect, was pretty miserable, traversing quite a lot of mountains to get to their destination. As the crow flies, Urartu is actually closer to the Assyrian heartland than a lot of these western areas, but of course the mountains make the journey far more arduous. The most well-preserved part of the poem is what happens as Shalmaneser gets deep into the heart of Urartian territory. The fragments before it tell us that he conquered his way in, leaving devastation in his wake. But then, right around mid-August, which is towards the end of the campaign season, he arrives at the capital of Urartu. At this point, Shalmaneser apparently begins singing, and his song goes something like this. The brilliance of the Lord of the Four Quarters overwhelmed them. They abandoned their cities and fled into the mountains and forests. Everyone ran for their lives into the terrible mountains. I went after them. I pursued them in the rugged mountains. I killed 18,000 enemies with the sword of battle. I threw their teams onto the plains like something. We can't read that part. I plundered the mules, horses, and donkeys without numbers. For 9 days I looted his palace possessions. I burned his many settlements. I drove the servant women of his land before my army. The trees which were the attraction of his royal city I burned. Statues proclaiming my might I erected by mountains and seas. As far as the edge of the land Nairi, at least what was left of it, to the land Gilzanu I went down. Horses as tribute I received in the cities Tiku and Hubuskia. The rest of my tribute I received in the city Turuspa, dedicating it all to Ashur my god. It's a bit of an odd song, but we got some pretty odd songs on the radio nowadays too. So after this singing, this musical interlude, he heads back home and arrives just in time for a divine festival in Arba'il. And then he sits down on the throne in Ashur and has all the booty paraded before him, which the king took as a sign of divine favor from the gods. This last part especially has a lot of the same energy as the royal annals, but is notably different in wording, saying many of the same things, but without the stereotyped phrases that we usually have in the royal declarations. Now, being a poem, we expect that this is probably a trace of the public-facing sort of pronouncements that the government would have regularly made. You see, the royal inscriptions that we usually read, most of them would have been completely indecipherable to the masses, who were, of course, largely illiterate, but even if they were being read out verbatim by some sort of herald, they're all typically written in a sort of standard Babylonian-style Akkadian, which is as incomprehensible to the late Akkadian and increasingly Aramaic-speaking masses as Latin was to the medieval peasant. Which is to say, not completely incomprehensible. They probably would have picked out a few words, it being a, older version of their language, and a fair handful of people may have been able to sort of struggle their way through and kind of understand. But it's pretty much over their heads. Read an original English version of Beowulf to sort of get an idea of the difference between these archaic languages and the modern ones. Thus, because this is a poem found on a clay tablet, rather than a prose inscription upon a wall, we assume that a poem very much like this may have been read out, either to the people at large, or perhaps more likely to the elites during the post-campaign celebration. And I'm going to say that because this poem is not very good, I at least assume that these sort of poems must have been quite common, and probably very few of them survive because their purpose was news and propaganda, not high artistry, not really record-keeping so much as just letting the people know what's going on from a government perspective. And so these sort of poems may not have been really valued as poems so much as they were valued perhaps as informational content. And if that's the case, it gives us a bit of a window into what the people who stayed home knew about a campaign, and we find that it's actually quite similar to what we read in the more exclusive royal inscriptions, which, as a historian, is quite heartening. There are some scholars who are generally skeptical about all our texts and suggest that the whole content of these royal inscriptions is fundamentally untrustworthy. Having evidence of this poem, at least, is yet another confirmation that, while they're certainly not above stretching the truth in these official pronouncements, this is hardly an unbiased accounting the overall course of events is probably reliable, which is nice for me since I've based a good deal of the last many episodes on the official Assyrian government records. Anyway, that northern campaign in the third year saw a destruction of the Urartian capital, but this was mostly just keeping an upstart in their place. We actually hear less about quantities of plunder from this attack than we might otherwise expect, suggesting they were at the extreme far end of their logistics tether, and simply unable to transport as much as they might otherwise have liked. Alternately, it may be the case that the Urartian capital had relatively little to plunder after the campaign of Shalmaneser's crowning year, when he had marched forth to deal with Urartian expansion right as his father was dying. But perhaps most crucially, one of the early lines in the epic indicated that the reason Shalmaneser was able to run 2 campaigns in a single year is because he was able to rely upon his turtan, Ashur-bel-Ka'in, to manage the administration of the new tributary states. Ashur-Nasir-pal, as we saw, would typically conquer a fortress city and just sort of park himself there for a month or so while handling all the arrangements himself. Our King Shalmaneser is much more confident, leaving these arrangements to trusted subordinates. In 852, the year after Karkar, Shalmaneser led a fairly minor military expedition, beating up the fairly minor Shubrian king near Mount Kashiari. Even the royal annals make very little of this. It was a rest year in between his grand western adventures. Also of note around this time, though, is that his turtan, Ashur-bel-Ka'in, seems to have died and been replaced by a fellow named Dayan-Assur. Now, in the histories, we usually say that these turtans die in office, but we almost never actually know that. He could have retired, he could have been fired, we have no idea, but we never hear drama about advisors being replaced, and so the simplest story is usually just, he probably died. Anyway, Ashur-bel-Ka'in is notable in that he's the first turtan that we really hear of doing anything beyond just being turtan. And it is easy to read too much into that, knowing as we do that the position of turtan is going to become much more significant pretty soon. That's some foreshadowing, by the way, if you weren't aware. However, we don't actually know that Ashur-bel-Ka'in's duties under Shalmaneser were significantly different from how they were under Ashur-Nasir-pal, because of course this was an advisor that Shalmaneser had inherited from his father. We frankly know very little about all the turtans. We're doing our best here to extract information from quite limited sources. We do know that Shalmaneser is more of a team player than his father, but it's only with Dayan-Assur that we're really going to see this make a difference. Now, Dayan-Assur will be turtan for most of Shalmaneser's life, outliving him possibly by a handful of years, though when exactly he died is uncertain. And he seems to have been something of a right hand to the king. Now, turtan is often translated as commander-in-chief of the military, but we know he would have had a pretty broad remit to do all sorts of civil and diplomatic tasks as well. And Shalmaneser is quite content to give Dayan-Assur very nearly all the powers of the king himself, allowing official business to be conducted in places where Shalmaneser can't be personally present. Indeed, the singular nature of Ashur-Nasir-pal's rule seems to have made some think that the Assyrian Empire had a crucial weakness. But whether or not this was the case, Shalmaneser attacked that weakness of super hyper-centralization pretty much right away by empowering not just his turtan, but a large class of major government servants. Now, in that category, we count the governors together with the top administrators, and we get maybe there is at this point perhaps 100 to 120 men living at the very top of Assyrian society. Now, most of these are provincial governors or the top handful of men around the top governors, and the pinnacle of the system is the cadre surrounding the king himself. Turtan is, under Shalmaneser, essentially a substitute king, lacking only in prestige and final authority. Then below the Turtan, there is the Rabshaku, which we see in the Bible famously as Rabshakeh, which is usually translated as cupbearer, but like medieval cupbearers, the position is far more ambiguous and powerful than simple personal servant, and is sometimes translated as chief of the princes, which is homophonically related, shaku sometimes having the meaning of being raised higher, or ideas like that. It's a Akkadian thing. Anyway, Nagir Akali means something like palace boss, and this too was likely originally a domestic function, which turned into something much bigger. Originally it might have been something like a personal accountant, but since the king's personal household was also the finances of the government, such a position became quite important. The only of these top positions that genuinely seems to have been a personal servant type position is Masenu, sometimes translated chamberlain, though of course all these positional translations are approximate, since the exact ideas and bounds of their responsibilities never translate super well. But this guy really did manage access to the king, and did manage the servants around him, we think, making him responsible for the king's direct living environment, and possibly also directing the king's scribes. Quite an important position, of course. Finally, among the pinnacle of central authority was a position called Shakinmati, governor of the lands, which was a position separate from the individual governors of the individual lands, this being governor of the lands like in a general broad sense, but how exactly he related to the individual governors is not always clear. Anyway, that's the positions, and those do get repeated on, and many of them were even present back in the Middle Assyrian period, though not nearly as prominent as they're about to become. And we rarely know more than the names of the people occupying these positions. And in this particular era, only Dayan-Assur stands out, at least until Shalmaneser dies. However, we do think that Shalmaneser's trust in these 100 or so men serves him extremely well throughout his reign. We've already seen how he was enabled to manage massive campaigns into Syria with some of the largest troop numbers in history up until this point. But the latter half of his reign, while, less frantic and less well recorded, we do see 2 more campaigns which are perhaps even greater logistical challenges, and these 2 would have been enabled by all of these provincial governors and all of these nobles allowed to really focus and contribute in their own little sphere to making the Assyrian Empire the terrible, terrifying force that it truly was. Looking at those campaigns then, in the east, the army pushed multiple times further than any Mesopotamian army had ever gone, going well into the lands of the Iranian tribes. None of the tribes themselves were any great challenge in these mountains, but just getting there was a tremendous feat. This was, in many respects, a very alien land where imposing order involved having strength in every little mountain valley at all times. Otherwise, some petty despot would rise up pretty much right away and take control. And so, actually holding it or uniformly integrating it into the Assyrian province or vassal system was simply out of the question. However, the local products, mostly metals and horses, were valuable enough to regularly raid and demand tribute from. And perhaps more importantly, it needed to be shown every, decade or so that the Assyrian army truly was capable of reaching in that far. Not so much to keep order directly, as to keep the trade routes clear. You see, trade is again alive with the distant regions of Central Asia and India. Trade with China is sort of debatable. It either occurred in very small volumes, or the people of Central Asia and India may have sold a few wares that came from either end of their trade network to the opposite end. While it's no longer the Bronze Age, and iron has largely replaced bronze for most practical implements, bronze is still in demand for a number of applications, all the way from, jewelry and luxuries and attractive things, all the way to precision edges, because you don't get to hold very sharp edges, or not nearly as sharp edges with iron, given the ironworking technology of the time. The sharpest things still need to be bronze. And this means that tin still needs to be imported regularly from the east. But the trade routes coming through the mountains are jam-packed with all sorts of wealth, both practical metals and luxury items, and it's going to be impractical to actively protect them through the Iranian mountains, at least until the rise of the Persian Empire. And so the king needs to make it clear that even though he can't always be there, when he does make his way into the mountains, he's going to be remembering who was and who wasn't preying on international trade. Now, in many respects, it's a tale as old as time. The concentrated force of civilized armies struggling against the difficult terrain and constricted logistics of the mountains, both of which favor the much smaller force sizes, ambush tactics, and limited ambitions of the local warlords. Nowadays, we think of Afghanistan as some, special place, I think due to the salience of the Greek and British and American experiences, but there are many mountainous areas that can lay at least some claim to being graveyards of empires. Interestingly, though, the Zagros Mountains are not like an Assyrian version of the Hindu Kush in that they're not actually a perpetual Assyrian quagmire in quite the same way. Indeed, when the Persians finally do challenge and overthrow the Mesopotamian empires, it won't be because their mountain fastnesses are impregnable, but because the Persians are able to successfully come down from the mountains and challenge the flatlanders on their own terms. The Assyrian Mountain War is fundamentally different from the Greek and British and Soviet and American mountain wars, and from many others. The Assyrians are extremely clear and extremely limited in their goals. They don't care, in general terms, what the mountain people do. The Assyrians have no particular interest in living safely among the mountains, nor are they worried about causing the mountain people to follow any particular ideology. The Assyrians' first goal is plunder, and frankly, they seem just as happy taking it at spear tip as they do having it delivered to them. Next up, they want both submission and victory, and these they can extract from anyone directly in front of them at will. If there are other tribes that they haven't yet encountered who haven't submitted, that's fine, as long as they submit when the army does come around. And when the tribes stop submitting, that's another chance for what are some fairly easy victories. We rarely get the sense for Shalmaneser that he ever really struggles in these mountains the way that he did out west, and an easy victory is better than a difficult one. Finally, there is the trade route issue mentioned previously, but while that's economically important, we don't have a very good sense of how strongly it played a role in the king's decision-making. Plus, it is in the interests of the mountain warlords not to plunder the caravans too hard, or the caravans might just take an alternate route. The moral being, that's how you win a war. You define your objectives very closely to be something that you know you can accomplish in a reasonable amount of time. And this is a moral that the Assyrians seem to have been well aware of. Compared with other historical nations, we don't often see them, at least not in this early period, picking fights that they can't win. And often when they do pick fights that turn out to be big struggles, like against the Western coalitions among the Neo-Hittites and Aramaeans, we can read into it that they're thinking long-term, trying to prevent a nascent threat from snowballing into an overwhelmingly powerful neighbor. I don't want to pull us into the fascinating story that is the rise of Urartu, at least not yet, but suffice to say that this is a theme of Assyrian intervention in the north up to this point. Shalmaneser is in such a rush north prior to his first year on the throne precisely because the full scale of the creeping Urartian threat seems to have only just become known, as they had recently taken a mountain fortress uncomfortably near the Assyrian border, so they had to be stopped now. Since, a growing threat will only continue to grow if it's not stopped. And Shalmaneser returned just 3 years later to wreak the destruction that we saw at the beginning of the episode. And then it would just be a matter of smacking them again once a generation or so, with the campaign north in 830 accomplishing this. And in fact, we could potentially lay the blame on the rise of Urartu into an historically interesting state on the fact that after that 830 campaign, there's going to be a period in which the Assyrian kings were a bit less focused on these external matters, so they couldn't go up and properly bop the Urartians on the head from time to time to keep them from really growing and snowballing. But we're going to get to all that quite soon. Not this episode, just soon in a general sense. Anyway, the other of Shalmaneser's great campaigns in the latter half of his life was out west. But by west, I mean really far west. In the year 839, his 20th year, he took his western expedition past Syria into Anatolia, to the Neo-Hittite state of Quet and surrounding territories. In a lot of ways, this is the mirror image to his campaigns in the eastern mountains. Shalmaneser here is at the very edge of his logistical tether, in a land that no Mesopotamian army has ventured into since Sargon of Akkad. And as we're getting closer and closer to Sargon II, this seems somehow appropriate. As the crow flies, this is way further than the eastern campaigns, reaching all the way into what will, in antiquity, be called the Cilician Gates. But of course the terrain and supply situation is far more forgiving here. This area is usually thought of as a gateway between Anatolia and Syria, but for Shalmaneser it seems to have been something more of a boundary, rather like the limit of the flatlands in his mind. And in an ideological sense, he may have felt a need to get this far in order to rule all the way to one end of the earth. It also gave him the ability to claim that he had come to dominate all the Hittites, which, not quite so grand a claim as it would have been 4 centuries earlier, but it's still something fairly significant. The fighting in Quet and the surrounding countries was large in scale, though not quite as large as the earlier Syrian campaigns had been. Assyria probably can't move quite so many troops so far. Now at this point, you don't really need me to narrate the blow-by-blow. Assyria attacked in 839, 834, and 833, and it's good that we don't need too many details because we largely don't have them. Shalmaneser is getting tired at this point in his career, though whether this exactly means that he's succumbing to age and disease, or if he's growing less ferociously motivated, or if there's just starting to be more and more internal distractions between construction projects and politicking, we simply don't know. As much as we want to see the sun starting to fade for the Empire, knowing the trouble that they're about to face, We really can't see any such thing in the texts directly. Shalmaneser has brought the empire to its height, unmatched by any Mesopotamian empire since Sargon of Akkad, and in its enduring nature, it is, in fact, far superior to the Akkadian Empire. And of course, it surpasses the Middle Assyrian Empire by virtue of these most recent campaigns of Shalmaneser himself. Trade is flowing freely from the Persian Gulf all the way to the Mediterranean coast. Plunder has filled the treasuries. And it might be that the pace of battle slows a bit at this point because the returns to war might be shrinking. The logistical burden of bringing an army to the edge of the empire at this point, compared to what the army will be able to carry back with them, which is less and less, might be causing diminishing returns to the yearly campaigns. Now all this sees the king focusing in his later years on more and more peaceful activities. As a pious man, we have records that a number of temples around the empire, including on the periphery, were patronized to a greater extent than they had been in quite a while, leading to renovations, reconstructions, and new constructions. In Kalhu, Shalmaneser built a great arsenal and probably also a government production and stockpiling center in the southwest corner of the city. While in Ashur itself, the entire set of walls seems to have been torn down to its foundations and reconstructed bigger and better for the first time in the entire Iron Age, a process that was completed in multiple stages because it was actually a really big construction effort. But unlike Ashur-Nasirpal, we are quite clear that Shalmaneser was not trying to do all this by himself with his own two hands. The governors maintaining the provinces, the central administrators keeping the government functioning, and with Shalmaneser at the heart of it, standing as a military and religious standard for all to be impressed by, it was a team effort, a collective thing. Of course, the Assyrian royal chronicles still give all the credit to Shalmaneser himself, but we just see the hands of a lot more people involved, and we see, if you can believe it, a little bit less insistence and ego on Shalmaneser's part compared to his father. Now, he marches out at the head of his armies, and he follows the ways of the gods. And that's what really matters. And the most remarkable thing is not so much that the nation is strong and stable so long as he does these things, but rather that as soon as he stops doing these things, it's really remarkable how quickly things start to fall apart. Now, the chapter on this great high note, one of the best times in history to be an Assyrian citizen, closes in 832. The previous year had been one of his great marches all the way to Kwe, where he had overthrown an enemy king, taken the great cities of the region, and appointed a friendly ruler who submitted that distant region to Assyrian overlordship. As the year turned, the gods were consulted, and the political situation examined, and it was determined that Urartu was starting to recover from the beating they'd taken a quarter century earlier. And so they needed another beating. And so the black obelisk of Shalmaneser, the only of his records that goes quite so late to tell us all this and what follows, tells us that the king mustered his chariots and his troops. But Shalmaneser is getting pretty old at this point. And there's also another section in the wall of Ashur that really needs the king's personal attention. And probably the omens weren't quite right for the king to go out this time. But the matter of Urartu was a very serious matter on the other hand, and so Shalmaneser turned to his unwaveringly loyal and well-rewarded number 2 subordinate, his turtan, Dayan-Assur, who would of course never betray him. And Shalmaneser said, "Here, take this army. the most powerful army in the entire known world, and take it to the northern edge of existence under your personal command. And I'm sure you won't turn them against me or the state, and when you return, you definitely won't come to, besiege the capital or anything like that. And so the records tell us that the Assyrian king did not accompany the army, merely issuing orders for them to go north. And the official record of Shalmaneser's obelisk states that it was Dayan-Assur who won the subsequent battle, which was a great battle with a good deal of plunder and corpses involved. And then, just as we would all expect, the turtan leading the army marched his way back to Kalhu, his weapons still sharp and still bloody, and under the leadership of Dayan-Assur, they peacefully turned over all their tribute and submitted ritually before the king and the gods and loyally dispersed for the year, giving up all their power in the face of the king. Now that worked out real well, and so next year when Shalmaneser received a report that one of his Syrian vassal kings had been replaced in a popular revolt, he decides that, he's still not feeling good enough to campaign, and so he puts Dayan-Assur once again in charge of the military. Then the king says, Dayan-Assur, you see those guys out west who rebelled against their king and as a result have gained a lot of power within their nation? Now only one thing on earth can overthrow them, and that's the army that I'm giving you total, unsupervised control over. If you were to emulate these rebels, there would be nothing left to stop you. So I'm just going to trust you to do your duty and bring your army back peacefully without getting any big ideas. And so Dayan-Assur took the army out west and put the fear of God into them. So much so that apparently the rebel king simply died out of fear. The rebellious soldiers then received a bit of Assyrian standard operating procedure involving bodies upon stakes, and Dayan-Assur then acted as kingmaker in a foreign land, receiving directly the submission of a new vassal king for the region and taking a whole ton of plunder. A statue of Shalmaneser was erected and set into the temple in the town of Kunula, since Dayan-Assur knew his master would appreciate that, but the turtan acted as king in general, until the day he returned to Kalhu, where he peacefully turned over his army and decided that today would not be the day he rebelled against the aging king and set himself up as ruler. In the next year, the target was pretty small, just some Habhu tribes, and so Shalmaneser didn't think twice about, letting Dayan-Assur borrow the army and head out for a bit of annihilating the land like a flood of radiant fearfulness. It's just like you do. In any case, the king himself was taking this extra free time to host some massive celebrations around the great gods. We don't know the details of these, but there seemed to be a multi-city parade of great gods beginning at the city of Dur, which would only be held a total of perhaps 4 times in Assyrian history, and seems to have been invented by pious Shalmaneser, or at least first patronized by him. While Shalmaneser was busy with his religious duties, Dayan-Assur was going nuts with the army. In 829, he attempted to replicate his king's great eastern expedition, and it's genuinely unclear whether Shalmaneser's expedition was or was not surpassed, as we don't know enough about the geography of the deep mountain tribes to know quite how far either man traveled. Still, the Turtan has spent the last 4 years proving himself against the greatest foes of north, west, and east, and what with the peace still on the Babylonian border, that's about as close as he can manage to making himself lord of the 4 corners of the earth in the king's dotage years. In 828, he again went north, and it was with the plunder of this expedition that the black obelisk of Shalmaneser was raised, commemorating the king's career and Dayan-Assur's strong supporting role up until this point. The obelisk was raised as part of the celebration of the king's 32nd year, which might seem like an odd anniversary, but you see, this was the king's 30th anniversary of his Limu year, which happens to be the second year on the throne. So what would in most cultures be a 30th anniversary festival ends up happening in year 32. We know nothing about what happened at this festival, and almost nothing about the last 5 years of Shalmaneser's life. But we get a sort of feeling that this festival and the events surrounding it were something of a tipping point. In my own estimation, I would say that the occasions surrounding the erection of the Black Obelisk, as well as the erection of a statue in another city to Dayan-Assur himself, there was a sense that Dayan-Assur was getting a little bit too big for his britches. Perhaps Shalmaneser trusted him too much. Or maybe he was getting a bit too ambitious. Or, as some have suggested, it may be that Dayan-Assur was a perfectly humble civil servant, carefully and loyally executing his duties, while it was the less worthy around him who just grew jealous at his competence and attractiveness and general goodness. The fact is, we simply don't know. And that'll leave us here at a cliffhanger, with Assyria having brought peace through slaughter to much of the Near East. And while things are tense among the noble classes, they seem to be well in hand for the general population who are finally enjoying some time free from the constant warfare and raiding activity that so often characterizes the internal politics of the ancient world. So join us next time as it all comes crashing down. We're going to weave a little bit of a story to fill in some very juicy gaps, and we're going to ask ourselves just how we know who the good guys and the bad guys are in ancient history. Thank you for listening.